All right, now we get serious. And the first serious thing I want to say is, I hope that you're not feeling like, what in the world has happened to me? Okay? Because my usual experience with groups, whether they're Christian or Messianic, it doesn't matter, is that when we start to really talk about the development of the Bible and the scholarship behind what's called textual criticism of the Bible, many, many people get scared. That's just frankly what happens. They get scared because they think, my gosh, what can I trust? I mean, if the Bible is just this collection of stuff and one group believed this, another group believed that, what am I supposed to believe? Okay? And I'm going to talk about that today. We're still going to do the academic stuff because you need to know. No, you're going to say, I didn't need to know that. It was much better when I didn't even have to think about this stuff. Okay? But the truth is you need to know. And the reason you need to know is because we're moving toward a Hebraic worldview, which is not based on the Western cognitive, mental, get all the answers view. Okay? And there's a reason for that. A big, very big, important reason, which we'll get to. But I want to just commend you for coming back. Yes. Because you could have said, I can't, this guy is just, forget it. I'm not coming back to here anymore. He's made my life already miserable. Why should I come back, right? When I did lectures in South Africa to groups like this, they eventually printed up a T-shirt which says, I met Skip Moen, he ruined my life. Yes, that would have been. But the point is, here's the point. It's Arnold Schwarzenegger, no pain, no gain. So if we don't go through this process of understanding what really happened, then we will basically live in the dream world that we had in Christianity when we were just believing the doctrine, right? Because the truth of the matter is, history makes a difference. And what happened along the history is what you need to know so that you can say, yeah, but I've thought about this, and it doesn't have to always make sense, but at least I know how it happened, right? I think that's an important building block of faith. How did this happen? Why did we come to believe this, right? Okay? So I'm told all I have to do is press on this, and it will come on. Oh my gosh, it does come on. But now see, this is the interesting thing. Gail said, you don't ever use notes? I said, no, I don't use notes. But now since I can't see what's behind me, I guess I'm going to have to turn around to see what I'm supposed to be talking about. By the way, now that we're talking about turning around, I should mention that your architecture, the architecture that you're used to in a church, is Greek, not Hebraic. Do you know why? Because you're all facing me, the priest in the front, who's really the spiritual guy, and you're just out there, the participating audience. Well, actually, you're not even participating, you're observing, which is exactly the way the Greek temple system was set up. Everything happened in the front with the priests and the officials and the oracles, etc., and all the people did was just observe. Okay? And you must have had that experience if you went to a Christian church, because you have ranks, rows of pews, and you just see what's happening. So the important people are up in the front. Right? You're just there to give your money, right? And so how is it different? Well, it's different. It's not much different here. You have tables instead of pews. But think about the Hebraic view. Do you know how a synagogue is built? Oh, no, don't tell me about the synagogues that you've gone to, because they're built on a Persian model from the 8th century. Tell me about the 1st century synagogues. How were they built? You're right. They were built with a bench that went all around the outside walls, of course much smaller than this, right? And everyone sat facing each other. Why would they do that? Because I can't see what's happening in your spirit if I'm looking at the back of your head. Right? Isn't that true? The only person in this entire room who sees everybody's face is me. Right? And I already know what I think, so I don't need to see your faces, but you need to see each other's faces, because what actually happens in communication is the interaction, the relationship that you have. So that means you need to see what's happening with other people. That's why I don't like doing stuff online, because I need the body language of everybody, right? So I can come back today and say, hey, it's okay, you were a little scared yesterday, but we'll be fine, okay? Do you understand what I'm saying? So if you really want to do Hebraic thinking, you have to start with Hebraic posture, which is very different than Greek, isn't it? Right? It's also very uncomfortable because we're not used to that kind of stuff where people actually see what's happening to me. Oh my gosh, I'm feeling a little tired today. Oh, and everybody's seeing that. Oh, I better stay alert. You know, do you understand what I'm saying? Okay? Think about how important it would be for you to all see each other. And by the way, that's exactly what happened in a synagogue. The person who wanted to speak or who read or whatever would stand in the middle. And everybody would see what's happening with everyone else. Important, huh? And it wasn't divided by women and men. That's an 8th century thing, right? The men and the women all sat together because there was only one bench around, right? If you go with me to Israel someday, we'll go to the synagogue in Magdala, which is probably the oldest synagogue discovered in the world right now, or the one in Masada, which we know is from about 72 AD, and you'll see one bench around the wall, right? Okay? So even though you're all facing me and we're going to go through this in a Greek style, I want you to think, there's somebody looking at the back of my head, I wonder what they're thinking, right? Okay? And if you want to turn around and take a look, it's okay. It'd be fine, right? Okay? So that's, in other words, the communication has to happen in community. It's communication, right? That's the whole idea. So you're not here to just learn from me. You're here to learn from everybody else. And by the way, they're all learning from you. And now here's a really interesting Greek concept. Do you remember when Yeshua talks about fruit? Okay? That's a really important concept in Greek because the idea is that the fruit that you have, that God provided for you, isn't for you. It's for everyone else. Right? When I lived in Florida, we had trees in the backyard. We had oranges and, grapefruit and that kind of stuff. Do you know what happens if you feed oranges to an orange tree? It dies because the soil is too acidic. If I plant oranges near the orange tree, it'll kill it, right? The oranges are produced for someone else to take and eat from, right? So that's the idea of what's happening here. You are all trees planted by God, and every one of you produces a special fruit, which is not for you. If you eat your own fruit, you'll wither and die. You were designed to feed everybody else. And by the way, they were designed to feed you. Okay? So the way that it works in community is Dave does one thing well for everyone, and we all do something that feeds him, right? The idea is you're all interdependent. And interdependency doesn't happen when you're looking at the back of somebody's head. The whole point is the more interdependency, the more relationship you have, the stronger the community becomes, and the closer it becomes to God's model of giving instead of receiving, right? God is in the distribution business, not in the accumulation business. Okay? So he plants all these trees so that you can distribute to everyone else. And by the way, in Scripture, you see that. Akal tokel, it means to feast, feast. It's the first thing that God tells Adam. By the way, you can feast, feast. We translate that as you can eat from all the trees of the garden. But the whole idea was that you can do yourself a favor and stuff yourself full with all the gifts of the people that are here. Okay? That's good. Yeah, it's cool. And it's the Hebraic idea that your mission in life is to give yourself away, right? In a community that willingly gives you back what you need. I can tell you're a grapefruit. You do not need grapefruits. You need all the other stuff that makes you a grapefruit, right? So that has to come from everybody here, right? So that you can produce the best grapefruits possible, right? Okay? So here's the lesson, because we're going to start on this heavy academic stuff. Here's the lesson. What you worry about when I'm talking about what happened in the transition of all this stuff in history, somebody else is also worrying about. What someone sees in here that they say, oh my gosh, eureka, I just understand it, is also something that somebody else is thinking. So the way that we will learn is not by listening to me, please. The way that you'll learn is by communicating all this among yourselves so that you're all feeding each other. All I'm going to do is put a little water on the plant. The rest of it is up to you, right? So let God grow in you in a way that you're willing to say, I just don't get that. Or, my gosh, that was so interesting, right? Communicate it, because that's how we grow.
Yes.
One of the great rabbinic sages used to say, Akiva, right? You know Akiva? Rabbi Akiva. Very, very important person in the first century. Contemporaneous with Paul, okay? Used to say, I learned a lot from my teachers, but I learned more from my students. And so that's the posture that we want to take. You know, you'll learn some things from me, but where you really will learn is in the discussion that's going to happen among you. Okay? So now I'm going to put a little water on the plant. That's all I'm going to do. And we're going to talk about text and transmission. How do we get the Bible that we have today? How did we get the Bible that we have today? Everybody has a nice printed copy of the Bible. Where'd it come from? Oh, yeah, yours came from, let me see, the New International. No, okay. Okay, yours came from David Stern's effort, okay? So let's try this. Let's see, does it work? Oh, I have to remember it's this one, okay? So yesterday we looked at some assumptions. And those assumptions are usually the things, you know, when you come to the garden, you come with a set of tools that was handed to you by the person who bore you. My son and his wife just had their first little baby boy, Malachi, right? Malachi, over the next few months, will learn a whole set of rules about what the world is like before he can say a single word. How's he going to learn that? He's going to learn that from the way his mom holds him, the way he's fed, the way he's talked to, the singing that goes on, the tension or lack of tension in the house. All those things are going to teach him before he can even verbalize anything, right? I have a friend, a therapist friend in South Africa. She employs a program called SHIP, which is an acronym for something, but it's developed in South Africa. And what's really interesting is that the experience of the therapists in this program has now been validated by other studies, and what it amounts to is this, that when a child is born into the world, that child brings trauma from the mother or the grandmother that was passed on from generation to generation, even if the child is not aware of it at all. Okay? In other words, there's this great saying from another book on therapy, pain is passed through from generation to generation until someone's willing to bear it. Okay? And that's basically what we're all about, right? There was a book back there called Guardian Angel, which is about the study of the Hebrew concept of a woman and how important that is and how utterly contradictory it is to the church's teaching that women are supposed to be in submission to men. That's not the Hebrew idea, and that's not what Paul said. Okay? But the point is that book is not written for you. It's written so that you will change your behavior for your children, right? Because the impact of what you do affects them, not just epigenetics, but the actual DNA that gets transferred to them from the kind of trauma that you experienced. Okay, let me give you a perfect example. It's perfect because it's my example. Okay, my mother, who died at 93, was sexually assaulted as an early teenager and never discussed it with anyone. Her father knew about it, but it was a member of the family, the extended family, and so it was just buried. Okay? So what did that teach my mother? It taught her to be afraid. It taught her that she couldn't trust even her own parents to defend her. Okay? Do you think that maybe had an effect on her 4 sons? I guess maybe it did. And guess what? She never told any of us until her deathbed. So all those years that we, all 4 sons, struggled with issues of being afraid, not trusting people, worrying about things, that were the process of a trauma that she was never able to resolve, got passed into the way that we thought about the world. We never knew where it came from. Right? We never knew. Because there was no community that she could go to that she felt safe talking about it. Okay? Now, you think, okay, that's just Skip's example. The same thing happens with Abraham. Right? Why are those stories so important? Look what Abraham does. He responds to God. By the way, it says, take your son, but it doesn't actually say take your son. In Hebrew, there's a vav that's attached to the verb that changes it from a command to a request. It should be translated, please take your son. So that Abraham has the right to say, no thanks, I just don't think I want to do that. Okay? And it's not a sin for him to say not to do it because it's not a command, it's a request. Okay? But we translate it, take your son, your only son, your beloved one, right? And Abraham responds. Great, Abraham's being obedient, being more than obedient because it's just a request. Okay? So we think, oh, this is great. Look at Abraham's obedience, fabulous. In fact, it's the only other time that he immediately obeyed. The first was the call. The second was when he takes his son. Okay? Now, here's a really interesting thing. Why would any father be willing to sacrifice his son instead of saying, take me, God? Right? Don't sacrifice my son. If God came to me and said that, I would say, look, I'll go in his place. I would rather die than have my son die. Abraham doesn't do that. In fact, Abraham doesn't even tell his son what he's doing. Remember when they get to the mountain? What does he say to the two servants? Well, his son says, well, here's the wood, here's the knife, but where's the sacrifice? What does Abraham say? Well, you know, son, we're here on a journey that God sent me on because God said to take you and sacrifice you. At least Isaac would know what the hell is going on, right? But what does Abraham say to the two servants? Oh, well, we're going to go up there and we'll be back. Okay? Think about that, and we will come back, and we will return. Okay? Then they go up there, and Isaac, for the first time in his life, discovers that his father, who's told him his entire life that he's the most important thing that ever happened in his life, is willing to kill him. Oh my gosh, talk about trauma. Everything that I knew about the relationship is instantly reversed. And by the way, there's a pattern, because he sent Ishmael and his mother off into the wilderness to die. So Isaac suddenly realizes that his father, who doesn't communicate that it's God that's involved, is actually creating a trauma in his life that is so damaging to Isaac that guess what? When Abraham comes back to the servants, is Isaac with him? Careful how you read the text. Abraham comes back, but Isaac doesn't. Okay? The next time we see Isaac, he's in Beer Lahai Roi. That's a really important thing. It means the well of my seeing. But it's really important that the scripture tells you where he goes because there's somebody else there. Okay? But when Abraham comes back to Sarah and comes back without her son, what does she think? He killed him. He was willing to do that with Ishmael. Why wouldn't he do it with Isaac? Okay? By the way, Beer Lahai Roi is the place where Ishmael and Hagar are living. Isaac goes there because those people understand the trauma that he's gone through at the hands of Abraham. Okay? How different would it have been if Abraham had sat down with Isaac after he heard God's request and said, listen, this is what God's asked me to do. And I want to explain it to you so that when we get there, you won't be traumatized by this action. I'm hoping that God will change his mind and that something will happen. But I want to be obedient to God and I want you to know. How different would it have been if he just communicated? But he didn't, right? My mother never told me what happened to her. Abraham never told Isaac what God was asking him to do, right? How many of us as parents have buried something that was either shameful or too difficult for us to handle, or our parents did the same thing, and we just pass it on? You know, the pain passes through generations until someone is able to bear it. Okay? So why do we need to know those stories in Genesis? Because there are stories. That's why. They're us. Okay? So, we have to start with this assumption. The Bible is God's word, but it isn't God's word, my folks, my friends. It's the stories about people who were interacting with God, right? It's stories written by human beings under the influence of what happened to them when they were interacting with God. Right? That's different than me thinking that God whispers the ears in my ear and I just write them down. This is me telling you what happened in my life when I was interacting with God or he was interacting with me. Okay? Which means that the stories are very human. And that's the way they need to be read. They're not doctrine, they're human. Yes, dear. Everybody wants to know. See,
all right. So
we're looking at your face now. Everybody turn so you can see her. Okay? All right, go for it.
Okay, so I was just thinking about Isaac. I mean, if Abraham had told Isaac beforehand, maybe Isaac would have run off or he would have foiled the whole thing, and that's why Abraham didn't tell him.
So Abraham assumed the risk of Isaac and denied him the choice. That's the problem. See, even if Isaac says, I'm not going to do that, Isaac is the one who makes the choice, not Abraham. Abraham made the choice for his son, without telling his son that what was going to be involved, right? Is that the kind of relationship that you want with your children? You tell them what to do and you don't tell them why?
No.
Right. So Abraham has a problem. And by the way, it's really interesting that some of the rabbis, the biblical discussion of Isaac and his character is really, really odd. It's so odd that some of the rabbis say that Isaac's view of God was demonic, that he spent almost all of his life running away from God until his encounter with Jacob in the tent where he pretends that he doesn't know what's going on. Okay? You want to know that whole story? There's a book, or there was a book, called Crossing, which is all about what's happening in the Hebrew text, all these hints and nuances in there to show you what happens when God deals with family dysfunctionality, right? And that the real father in that whole thing isn't Abraham, it's Pharaoh. Because the generations go, Abraham makes a mistake, Isaac buries the trauma, Jacob buries the trauma, Joseph buries the trauma, Pharaoh finally redeems everyone. Wow. The outsider, the guy who doesn't even believe in God, is the one who redeems everybody. Oh, is that a pattern? Yes, Gail.
And I think it's very telling and interesting. And by the way, I did read your book, The Crossing.
Oh, good.
Crossing. It's very, very good. Very human story.
I like that endorsement. Please,
yes.
now
Isaac
I'm expecting
is,
150 copies to be sold. Okay.
Isaac is then known as, Yah is known as the God Isaac fears.
Yeah, it's
The
actually
God
not
Isaac
fear.
feared.
It's not yareh, it's pahad, and it means dread. It doesn't mean fear. This is really important, see? Because we're instructed to fear God. That's the Hebrew verb yareh, okay? But that isn't what it says about Isaac. It says that Isaac dreaded God. And who says that? His son, Jacob, who says, the God of my father Abraham, but Abraham isn't his father, is it? Isaac is his father. Oh, Jacob got confused? No, I don't think so. What he's saying is, he recognizes the relationship between God and Abraham, and he considers that a fatherly relationship, okay? But when it comes to his own father, he says, and the dread of Isaac. Okay? What does that tell you about Isaac's relationship with God? He was scared to death of him. Why wouldn't he be? Because first, God tried to kill him, and second, the firstborn is the one who is going to be executed in Isaac's mind, and who's the firstborn? All kinds of things are happening here, isn't it? All kinds of stuff that's buried in the Hebrew text that we didn't see because we read it like theology instead of like human history, like a human narrative. Look at this person way back here who wants to ask something.
I'd like to respond to your putting forth that Pharaoh was kind of the redeemer of... that one is kind of confusing to me. Because remember, I'm molded by the church.
Yeah, okay. So let me give you two quick responses. The first is the idea comes from Jonathan Sacks, who was the chief rabbi of Great Britain, in his book, Not in God's Name. Okay? The second is, what does Pharaoh do that a father should do? A Pharaoh gives Joseph a new identity, right? And a place of responsibility. So Pharaoh does what Jacob should have done, what Isaac should have done, what Abraham should have done. Give him an identity and a place of responsibility. And stop making all the decisions for him and let him become the person that he was supposed to be. Right? There's more to it than that, but that'll get you thinking about it. And it's not the same Pharaoh that was the Pharaoh with Moses. It's a different Pharaoh, of course. A Pharaoh who actually comes close to being a believer, right? Remember when Joseph says, let me take the bones of my father, da-da-da, and Pharaoh provides him with all the accoutrements in the army and everything to do that, right? And you might think about Pharaoh's response to Jacob when he meets Jacob. Really interesting. So now you get to go back and look at that story again. Okay. I mean, there's all kinds of fascinating stuff in here if we start recognizing that it's stories about human beings, okay? And sometimes it's stories about human beings that we know God is interacting with, but God never shows up, like like Ruth and Esther, right? I mean, they don't even mention God, but you know he's back there someplace. So then we have to figure out what's this story all about if it doesn't even talk about God. And of course, what you realize is God's behind it all anyway, which is what we need to know. That in our lives, often, we're just like Ruth and Esther, and we don't see God show up. But he's there anyway, and that's what Ruth and Esther are there to tell us, right? You might just go along with the political, social, economic decisions that you have to make, just like Esther did, or you might be committed to somebody else in a relationship where the other person tries to damage you all the time, like Ruth, but behind it all is God's handiwork. Isn't it nice that there's two stories like that? Okay? So, first assumption that I think I've thoroughly squashed, I hope, is that the Bible is God's Word. I would rather read the Bible is human stories about the interaction of God in their lives. That doesn't mean it's not God's Word, but it's not God's Word in the sense that he whispered it in my ear and I wrote it down. It's God's Word in the sense that I wrote about what God did so that you can read it and say, oh my gosh, that helps me understand what's going on. Okay, next one. The Bible is true and accurate in every category. Sometimes you get people saying, Yeshua said that the mustard seed is the smallest of all seeds. But it's not the smallest of all seeds. So, okay, fine. Does that mean that the Bible's wrong? Well, it's not the smallest of all seeds. But the point of him saying the mustard seed is the smallest of all seeds isn't about a biology issue. It's about a paradigm of how things grow. Okay? So, yes, the Bible is true in regard to what it's attempting to achieve, but that doesn't mean that it's scientific. Okay? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We talked yesterday about Bereshit and how it doesn't mean in the beginning, right? And to think that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth is a pre-scientific statement is to ignore the audience. Because who's the audience of that? When I write, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the deep. Why? Okay, you want it in Hebrew? We could do it that way. But the point is, what was the point of that? To tell you a pre-scientific Big Bang theory? No, what was it about? Here's what it's about. Who's the audience? Who's the audience? That story, every story is written for somebody. Who was the audience? Oh, well, let's hope it was in that time, because it's only written for an audience of the time. I'm not writing for an audience that doesn't exist. Israelites coming out of Egypt. And they had, what we talked about yesterday, Egyptomania. They had absorbed Egyptian ideas, okay? So, when God began to create the earth was without form and void. Without form and void is an Egyptian idea. Do you know what the Egyptian cosmology is? The Egyptian cosmology is a sea of chaos. The earth floats on the sea of chaos, protected by the god Nut from the stars which are trying to attack the earth. And all that kind of stuff is terrible, scary, awful stuff. And was without form and void. And darkness was on the face of the deep. really terrifying words for people who believe in Egyptian cosmology, right? So if your audience believes in Egyptian cosmology, do you start talking about special relativity theory? No, you talk about the cosmology that they believe. You talk in words that they understand. And then you say this really important phrase, and the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the deep. All of a sudden, all of the fear that was part of the Egyptian cosmology is removed. Because the Spirit of God hover. That's like a mother chick, mother hen hovering over her chicks, right? In other words, it's peaceful and calm and reassuring, which is exactly what they needed to know when they came out of Egypt, where everything was chaos and battle and, strife, okay? So, the point of the Genesis account is not to give me science, it's to give me, as an ex-slave coming out of Egypt, reassurance that God is in charge, that he knows what he's doing. And the whole rest of the first chapter is about setting boundaries, right? Until we get to the end. Remember what the end is? 26 and 27. What does Genesis 1, 26 and 27 say? Yes, I see your hand back there. What is it? Oh, you're just stretching. Yes, dear. Let us make man in our own image. Salem and demut. The Bible never uses two words where one will do. So you're going to need to know Salem and demut. We'll talk about that later, okay? Let us make man in our own image according to our likeness, and let them what? Let them what? No, that doesn't come, that is in there, but there's another word that's really, really important. And let them rule. Okay, who's the audience? Who's the audience? Israelites. What do they know about ruling? Nothing. They were slaves. So guess what that verse says? God made you not to be a slave. God made you to rule. Your identity is not ex-slave. Your identity is godly given rule. Okay? And by the way, there's two different words in Hebrew for rule, and it's really important that you know which one is which. Because some are about the ruling of the sun over the day and the moon over the night, not the same word. Okay? But you knew that, right? Because just because English uses rule for both of them doesn't mean it was the same Hebrew word. So now you got to go look and see what the nuances are for the two different words. And when God said, rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, what is he saying to these people? I'm going to change your entire thinking about your identity. You're no longer what you have been told you are for the last 400 years. You are something different. And you were that difference from the very first. Right? Huge issue for ex-slaves. Not so big for us because we don't experience that stuff. So we read it and let them rule over the fish of the sea, birds of the air, and take dominion, and we're like, okay. But it wasn't okay. It was like, wham, in your face, powerful stuff, right? Okay, and then there's this other really interesting verb in the same verse, right? Because it talks about what they're supposed to do with the earth. Remember the verse? Who's got the verse? What are they supposed to do with the earth? Subdue it, okay? But wait a minute. If the verse is written for Adam, what does he have to subdue? Not a damn thing. It all works perfectly. Right? He lives in the garden. Everything is fine. Except for that wife, of course, who gets him to buy into this tree. But everything else is really good. Right? So the commandment to subdue the earth doesn't make any sense at all to the actors in the story. So who was it written for? It was written for the ex-slave Israelites who needed to know God was in charge. The world is not going to come out and get me. I was designed to rule, and I need to go to work to subdue the earth. They knew what that was all about. Adam had no clue. So obviously Adam wasn't the audience. The audience was the people who needed to know the story. So does that mean that God said to Adam, subdue the earth? Adam's like, what are you talking about? I'm not going to subdue nothing. Just throw my fishing line into the water and out jumps a red salmon. Right? Okay? I don't have to do anything. The moose, they come right to my door, so I don't have to even go look for them. It's perfect, right? Okay? The point is, that doesn't make any sense to Adam. So obviously the story wasn't written for Adam. It was written for people for whom it makes sense, which means that probably God didn't say to Adam, subdue the earth, because he wouldn't have understood what that meant at all. But the people who heard the story knew what it meant, right? Oh, there's a scary implication there in case you didn't know, right? Did you get the implication, this really scary implication? What? That the story of Genesis about Adam and the woman was written for an audience and it wasn't written as historical. It was written for an audience to teach them something about their own identity. And that means it could have been, can I say the word? It could have been made up in order to convince these people about what their true identity was. It's not made up as too derogatory. It's a legend, and we have lots of those. Every tribe has legends about its identity, its purposes, how they interact with the world, how they interact with God. Those legends, right? We just think that the Bible isn't like that. The Bible's somehow not like all the other tribes of the world that have legends about who they are and what they have to do. Until we start asking, why would God tell Adam to subdue the earth when he doesn't have to? Right? And then the day that you eat of this, you will die. What does that mean? What does that mean for the character in the story? It means perfectly well to the Israelite ex-slaves. They know exactly what that means. Does Adam know what that means? How could he know what it means? There hasn't been any death. So it's a threat that's not a threat, because it doesn't mean anything to him. It's like saying to Adam, the difference between obedience and disobedience is not the same as the difference between right and wrong. As Maimonides says, Adam has to know what obedience and disobedience means, but he doesn't have to know what right and wrong is because he hasn't eaten from the tree. The fact that he hasn't eaten from the tree can't possibly mean that he knows the difference between right and wrong because he hasn't experienced it. But he knows what it means to do what God says. Right? Lots of interesting things going on. Okay? So, accurate in every category? Maybe we have to start asking ourselves, who was the original audience of these passages, and what does that help us understand about what they were thinking? Because the original audience is the one who actually has the meaning of the story tied into it, right? I don't send messages to people in languages that they don't understand or in vocabulary that they've never heard. I can see there's this hesitance to get another question up there. Yes?
Right. Hello, am I on?
Yes.
Oh, all right, okay. So I took a history of Alaska class some time back, but there was a legend in Alaska Native history that God told one of the natives that he was going to send a flood on the earth and that he needed to make a raft and that whoever he wanted to be saved from drowning should be with him on the raft. And that was one of their legends. And
Yeah.
then there's a story about how it floods and it even goes over the highest mountains, but then they're all saved. And
Yeah. And that legend shows up in all kinds of cultures all over the world. Not just in Alaska. All over the world. There's a legend of the flood. Okay? Goes way, way back. Okay? So, does that mean it never happened? It's just a legend? Or does it mean that something happened that had a traumatic effect on human beings, and the story was populated from tribe to tribe, depending on where people migrated, and they kept that legend alive? Who knows? But we see these themes show up from one culture to the next, don't we? Okay? So why would we suppose that the only accurate description, the only historical description, is the biblical account? because we have a presupposition about what the Bible is about. And that's what I'm trying to get you to think about. What are my presuppositions about the Bible? And are they supported by actually reading the text? Yes, sir.
I would argue that the Bible is true and accurate, but since it's the living Word of God, and it's the glory of God to conceal a matter, but the glory of kings to search it out, we don't always know what we're reading when we read it. And so I do agree with you that we should face our preconceptions, but I don't agree that the Bible isn't true in all counts, because it is. It just, you might not understand what you're reading.
Okay, so it's true, but you don't know if it is.
No, I know that it's true.
Well, how can you know
But-
if it's true if you don't know what you're reading?
Well, there is the basic truth, right? That God
okay, so the
is,
basic truth is the presupposition that the Bible is true.
Well, yes, because faith in God is attached to faith in the Word of God.
Got it. That is the most important thing that you said.
Right.
Because, quite frankly, I can't tell if something's true if I don't know what it says. And if my presupposition that it is true comes before I know what it says, then it's just a presupposition, an assumption. But what you said is faith in God is attached to. And the most important thing that you said is faith in God is not the same as the Bible is true. Right? That's what you just implied. That faith in God is attached to this idea that the Bible is true, which means they're two separate ideas. Thank you so much. You just introduced what we're going to talk about. Because that's really, it's really, really important, because we get that we somehow connect faith in God with the Scripture as though they're the same. Right? And now I'm going to take you through a whole long scholarly argument about all the stuff that's going on with scholars who are looking into the text, and at the end you're going to say, oh my gosh, what happened to my idea of the Bible? Nothing. It's okay, because the Bible isn't what I believe in. You understand? I believe in the relationship that I have with God. Abraham didn't have a Bible. Did that mean that he didn't have a relationship with God because he couldn't consult the Word? Of course not. Right? Yes?
True.
True. So if I want an Abraham experience of God, and he had a pretty good one, God talked to him face to face, right? If I want that, do I need the Bible to do that?
Abraham was a friend of God, right?
Yeah, he was a friend of God without the text. So the text is supplemental, isn't it? The experience comes
But
first.
That doesn't make it not true just because it was written after.
Yeah, but it does make it impossible to understand that it could be true if I don't know what it says. I mean, that, let's first recognize that the Bible isn't the fundamental building block of our faith. The fundamental building block of our faith is our relationship to God.
Well, it would be the blood of Jesus, right?
I'm sorry, what?
It would be the blood of Jesus, right? The foundation of our salvation.
All
right, I'll let you move on. But
Thank you. Okay, but do you understand what I'm saying? We have conflated the assumption about the truth of Scripture with the relationship with God. But obviously that couldn't have possibly been the case with Noah, Abraham, maybe even not David, certainly all the people before the discovery of the Torah with Ezra and Nehemiah, right? Because the text wasn't there. Not the text that we have today. Did that mean that they couldn't have a relationship with God because they didn't have the text? Of course not. We wish we had a relationship with God like Abraham and David, because why? Because their relationship was experiential. It was what was happening to them, not from reading the text and meditating on the Word, but from actually having an experience with God, which is, by the way, why you are here. You're not here because you memorized a verse in Scripture and it told you to come here. Right? You're here because you have a relationship with God that is driving you to think about how he communicates with us. But the relationship comes first. Even if you couldn't tell me how it happened to you, something happened to you. That's why you're here, because something happened to you. All the rest is trying to interpret what it means. Right? So the Bible is a story of the experience that these people had with God. And they wrote it down, and first they told the story, then somebody wrote it down, then somebody modified it to fit the paradigm, so that ultimately we're reading it thinking it's applicable to us, when in fact what's really happening is we're attempting to interpret an experience that they had, which is exactly what you do. You come here because you want to understand what happened to me. Right? And when it comes right down to it, if you didn't have the Bible, you would still have a relationship with God. And if you don't have a relationship with God without the Bible, then your God is the text, not the person. Right? That you've made an idol out of it, which is, by the way, one of the things that Moses discovers when he comes down from the mountain. What he's discovered is not just that they have the golden calf, that they've made a symbol of their relationship, but they will do the same thing with the tablets. Because their mindset is what they can see in front of them, what they can touch, what they can feel. It's not about the relationship of this God who descended on the mountain. It's about the tactile information that they get, right? So whether it's golden calf or the tablets doesn't matter. So Moses smashes the tablets because he says to them, you're not going to start worshiping these tablets. Crash. Right? Because the point is they should be worshiping the God behind the tablets. Right? Do you understand? Does everybody get this? Okay? Because if you get this, we've made big progress. Because what that helps you to realize is that this book that you carry around is a fabulous, wonderful commentary on relationship to God. Okay? It gives you plenty of instruction, it gives you plenty of history, it gives you plenty of examples of real human beings who had real experiences with God, and it helps you by giving you instruction about what to do with that, but it is not God. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so
You have a lot of questions, you know. Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
You don't
that
have to
might
be
be
sorry.
the Jewish in me. I don't know, but
Okay.
anyway, I was reading the book of Jasher, and it talks about how Abraham was developing a relationship with God, with Noah being his mentor. And then it even had this story about him being thrown into a furnace, and then it was like a repeat of Shadrach, Abednego.
Sure, of course.
And
So
all
the
that.
guy who wrote Jasher just took a whole bunch of stories and put them together and put them in the mouth of Abraham, which is really terrific.
Okay, so
Right?
there may not be any truth to those stories.
Well, wait a minute. Let's stop. There may not be any truth. That means that you know that there's a standard by which you measure these stories, and you've decided that this one might not match up to the standard. But what is the truth then? Is the truth that combining all those stories in the life of Abraham makes Abraham even more important to understand in his relationship with God? Is that what the purpose of the account is? Or is it historical? So that if he doesn't get the history right, it's not true.
Well, it just seems like there's some holes in the stories of the Bible, and when you read those other stories, it kind of fills in the holes.
Yes, and maybe that was the purpose of the guy writing the thing in the book of Jasher. And he's trying to fill in the holes, because the rabbis do this all the time. They try to fill in the holes, right? Because they're thinking, oh my gosh, there's a mistake, there's something missing here, so we'll just add it in. Does that mean that they think it's not true?
I don't know.
It depends on what you mean by true, doesn't it? If you mean historically accurate in every category, then you're going to find out that it isn't true, because Abraham probably didn't fall into a furnace. Okay? But if you mean that the purpose of the account is to draw me closer to God, because I realize that Abraham suffered all the things that other people suffered as a precursor to what God is doing, then I can say, wow, that really helped. Okay? So is the truth cognitive, that I have to get all the boxes checked right? or is it experiential, that it makes me feel closer to God? Right? This is a big deal, in case you haven't figured this out. It's a very big deal, because it depends. The way that you answer that question will depend on how you understand what Scripture is all about. Let me also tell you that from my perspective, it's only my perspective, from my perspective, it's incredibly freeing, because what it allows me to do is have imaginative exegesis, which is what the rabbis do, right? They take a verse over here, and they take another verse over here, they take one from out here, and it looks like left field, and they say, oh, don't you see they're all connected? But I don't see how they're all connected. They happen in completely different environments, a different history, all that kind of stuff. But they connect them all. And so what I have to do is think like the rabbis and say, oh my gosh, what were they trying to do there? Were they trying to give me a corrected history? No. They were trying to get me to pull into the text so that I would understand what my relationship to God might be if I just could think about the different ways that he interacted with people, right? And that means that the Bible becomes a tool for me to be creative, right? To start, and which is what the oral Torah does, elaborating on the text. Okay? Yes?
Thank you. Is it possible that
Yes.
we could, everything, right? That we could trust the Ruach HaKodesh to speak to our spirits and interpret anything that we might be reading in the Bible itself, in the Torah itself.
Is it possible?
Without, I mean, I can't see myself picking up the Bible, the Torah, and calling it legend or story. I have to trust that the Ruach HaKodesh is interpreting for me.
Yes.
And helping to increase my faith.
Okay, so that's a really good comment, and we'll talk about the place of the Holy Spirit in all of this. But let's just back up and let me say that you have a very truncated view of legend, as though somehow legend is like Aesop's fables. It's not true stuff, okay? But legend has played an enormously important role in the development of human society in all ages, and especially in the ancient world, okay? So it's not like legend is fake and history is true, okay? So what we want, because we have a different view of history than the ancient world, what we want is to pretend that the Bible is historically true. That means it's factual, as opposed to being legendly true, if I can make up the word, right? And that only reveals our own predisposition to fact, as though somehow facts are independent of our own assumptions, okay? I tried to make this point yesterday, that facts belong to a paradigm. The paradigm determines what's a fact and what isn't a fact. Let me give you another example. Is parapsychology about real things or about fake things? Depends on which school of psychology you belong to. If you're Rogerian, it's nonsense. If you're Adlerian, maybe. If we go down the list, Freud, etc. Is the id, the ego, and the superego, are those real? Well, it depends on if you're Freudian, right? I mean, the whole point is the paradigm tells me what the facts of the world are. If you don't like the psychology example, let me give you an example from chemistry, one of the hard sciences, okay? Many years ago, chemists discovered this really odd thing, that some chemical or some compounds that you burn get heavier. That doesn't make any sense. If you burn something, it combusts, things go away from it, smoke, flame, etc. It should get lighter. But some compounds get heavier. And they could not for the life of them figure out how that happened. So guess what? They invented a theory to explain it, right? The theory was phlogiston, which floats around in the air, invisible, and for some reason it attaches to things when they're burned and it makes them heavier. Okay? They didn't understand oxidation reduction, right? Which is a theory that came later. Does that mean that when phlogiston was popular, it wasn't true? Careful. Because you're inclined to say, yeah, it wasn't true because later we discovered oxidation reduction. Okay? Does that mean that Newtonian mechanics are not true because now we have Einstein? But for centuries, people believed that they were true. For centuries, people believed in the Copernican model of the universe, which isn't true. It's only true. It's only not true by hindsight. In other words, after all that happened and we discovered something else, we look back and say, oh my gosh, they were mistaken. Do you suppose that's not possible when it comes to legend and stories and narrative and sacred text? There'll never be a time when you look back and realize that what you interpreted once isn't true now? I mean, all you got to do is look at the history of exegesis and you'll see that 150 years ago, the exegesis about the distribution of ethnicity in the world was very, very different, all justified by biblical texts, right? It's changed. Why? Because we're further down the road and we realize that what they thought was true then isn't true now, okay? So, doesn't that apply to the biblical text as well? Right? So whatever we believe is true about the Bible now is true and it'll never change, but people have believed all kinds of things about the Bible. What about end times? End times theology has been going on since the year 100. And in every century, someone has come out and said, this is the end. And as far as I can tell, they've all been wrong. Right? I mean, as far as I can tell. I mean, I'm not sure, but it sure looks like they were wrong. Okay? But they absolutely believed that they had the correct exegesis of the Bible when they pronounced that the end of the world was going to happen. Right? So, how do we deal with that when we want to read the text? Do you have a little, you have a mobile question mark that you can move across the text? You just say, oh, I'm not sure about this one, not sure about this one, right? What do you have to do? You have to keep looking, searching, asking, because it's fluid enough so that it can be interpreted by whatever culture has got it. I'll give you just a classic example. If you go to Jerusalem, no, it's not in Jerusalem, it's in Nazareth. If you go to Nazareth, there's a Catholic church there. The Cathedral of the Virgin Mary or something like that. I can't remember exactly what the Catholic title is. You can't go in unless you're a Catholic, so I've never been in. Yeah, you have to get the permission of a priest in order to go in. But you can go into the courtyard. And in the courtyard are a whole series of mosaics in the colonnades around the church, right? And every mosaic is a picture of the Virgin Mary and the Christ child from the various cultures around the world. Okay? So tell me what the picture of the Virgin Mary and the Christ child looks like from India. Indian. What does it look like from El Salvador? Spanish. What does it look like from Russia? Russian. What does it look like from Thailand? Thai, right? In other words, Mary and the Virgin and Mary and the child have no identity. They're whatever you want in any culture that you want, right? This is the Catholic universalism of Christianity. Jesus is whatever culture you want him to be, right? And by the way, there is no Jewish picture. Jesus cannot be Jewish, and his mother can't be a Jewish, young woman. He has to be everything except Jewish. Okay? So what does that tell me? It tells me that the paradigm for interpreting the text of the apostolic materials, the Gospels, doesn't depend on what's actually happening in the Gospels. It depends on what theology I have. Right? And if that's true for the Catholic Church, why do we think we're so immune to the same kind of issues? Sit down with a Jewish rabbi and start talking about what's happening in Scripture. And you're going to get a very different view than the one that you have. Okay? So who's right? They've had the text for 3,000 years. You've only had it for, right? So who's right? But the point is we have to have enough flexibility to realize that we might argue and debate about the text, and there might be legend, there might be story, there might actually be historical stuff, there might be all kinds of other things, poetry and narrative and erotic poems and all kinds of stuff that's in there, right? Okay? But the point is, that isn't the foundation of your faith. The foundation of your faith, just like I sit down with the rabbi in Parma, we don't agree on all the text, but we agree that relationship with God is what matters. Right? We don't get hung up on the details because we're both there to find out more about our relationship with God. Okay? Well, we've covered that, basically, right? The Bible isn't written for you. It's written for the audience that it was delivered to. And you are the eavesdropper on that audience, and sometimes you can figure out that the application belongs to me, but it's the application, not the text. When Paul wrote his letter to the Thessalonians, he wasn't thinking about Anchorage, Alaska. Right? In fact, when God commanded the people to follow the ritual of Sukkot, he wasn't thinking about Anchorage, Alaska. Because it's a little difficult for you to live outside in a tent at that time of the year. Or better yet, when he said you should follow the Shabbat, and which begins on when the sun goes down and ends when the sun comes up, right? You might have a very difficult time in Nome. Right? I mean, the whole point is it's written for a culture. It's written for a people. We apply it, but that doesn't mean it was written for us. We've eavesdropped on God's conversation with Israel and applied it to our lives. That's different, isn't it? Which means that the Bible isn't the foundation of my relationship. The foundation of my relationship is my experience with God, and this book helps me to understand what that experience is like as it applies in my culture. Right? Well, we think it's good. Okay. So, that means the ancient world's view of history isn't our view. And as we mentioned yesterday, the ancient world's view of history is not written according to chronology. It's written according to importance. So that means if our standard is what happened next, we won't find it in the Bible. Sometimes we will, but we'll also find pieces of the story that are at the end instead of at the beginning that should have been there. And we'll find pieces that got left out in one version and added to another version, because what matters is the importance, right? What matters is the intention of the author for the audience he's writing to. And if you need to know it, that's what he's going to make important, right? And the other stuff, go look somewhere else, right? Okay? Event accounts were recorded in their cultural setting, right? Which means that if I want to understand what's happening in the event account in the Bible, I first need to ask, who's the audience? What time did it happen? What did they already believe? And then I can start to work on what did Yeshua say and why did they interpret it that way? Or what was Moses talking about? Or on and on and on. Because if I ignore the cultural setting, I don't have an understanding of the exegesis of the text. I might have an understanding that warms my heart, but that's not the same as understanding what was happening in the biblical text, is it? Okay? And the Tanakh is not a history of the Jews. Right? Look, 92% of the Bible is about Jews. That's just a fact. Okay? But it isn't about the history of the Jews. Because if it was about history, then it would be chronologically sequenced. It's about God's interaction with the Jewish people according to what they think was important in their recording of the event. Okay? So our version of history is chronology. This caused this, caused this, caused this. The biblical version of history, even though it's about the Jews, isn't this caused this, caused this. It's God did this, and then he did this, and oh, by the way, then he used to do that, and now he forgot about, but he remembered that he was doing that, and It's all over the place, okay? That's why the rabbis can say really interesting things like in Joshua 5, okay? So in Joshua 5, you know this passage. In Joshua 5, they cross the Jordan, okay? Two interesting things happen when they cross the Jordan. The first is, it says that God instructs Joshua to circumcise all the men who aren't circumcised so that then they can go into battle, okay? Well, that seems like a pretty stupid thing to do if you're going to be a military man, because let me tell you, if you circumcise adult males, they're not prepared to go to battle. Okay? They have to recover, okay? So it seems that God just made a mistake there. If he wants to be militarily correct, he wouldn't tell Joshua to do that. But the reason he tells Joshua to do that is because of a verse that says, where God himself says, by this action I have removed the shame of Egypt. You're thinking, what? How was God shamed by them not being circumcised? Now we have to back up through the culture and find out why there are even any people that are crossing the Jordan who aren't circumcised. Didn't they all come out of Egypt? No. The ones who came out of Egypt died. That means that during the time in the wilderness, they weren't circumcising their children. Why? Didn't God tell you that you had to circumcise a child on the 8th day? Does that mean no one was born during the 40 years? Of course not. There's a whole group of people that are going across the river that weren't circumcised. Why not? Because their parents were being disobedient. And the same parents who were being disobedient during the 40 years were being disobedient in Egypt. And the shame in Egypt is that those people weren't obeying God in the first place. So now he's going to have them circumcised to remove the scandal of people who claimed to be following God while they were in Egypt, but not doing what God said. Okay? That's the first thing. All cultural. Okay? There's the event, circumcision, but the event only makes sense in the culture. Okay? Next thing is, when the priests crossed the Jordan, it says that they went to the middle of the Jordan, right? And then all the people crossed, and then they took the ark and brought it up. Okay? But what's really interesting is in Hebrew, it isn't the same word that's used for when the people cross. So it says that they brought it up on a certain kind of soil. And the meaning of the word is soil that had once been wet from natural processes like rain and was now dry. But obviously that can't be the soil that they crossed in the Jordan, because that soil was God removed the water, so they crossed on dry ground. So it wasn't once wet by natural processes and then dried out. God did it. Okay? So that says that the priest returned to the bank of the soil that was naturally wet once and now isn't. And so then the rabbis say, wait a minute. If they took the ark back to the east side of the Jordan, right? They crossed over to the west. They took the ark back to the east side of the Jordan. How does the ark get in front of the people when they march into Israel? Simple. The ark flies across. No, you heard me right. The ark itself flies across, and the priests which are hanging on to it are transported to the other side of the Jordan by the ark flying across. So there's not just one miracle, the river dries up and the people cross. There's another even greater miracle. The ark flies across and takes the people with them. It's the first commercial flight, right? Okay, the whole point is you read that into the text because of the Hebrew verbs, right? But you didn't know that, did you? So guess what? The rabbis filled in a gap in the text because it indicates that the priest went to the wrong side. So they had to fill it in. So they came up with this imaginative exegesis that says that the ark flew across and took the priest with them. Right? Now you're thinking to yourself, but that's just a story. Whoa! My rabbi went to a yeshiva in an Orthodox Jewish community where his father was a rabbi, and that's what he was taught. So of course, that's what happened. Right? Do you understand? You have the exegesis follows the paradigm. Right? And we look at the flying of the ark across with the priest hanging on as kind of, oh, that's really odd. But we don't think that we do the same thing. We do the same thing. We're just not aware of it. Right? Just like my rabbi friend Because for him, that's perfectly normal. Two great miracles, right? Okay. So history is a story. So I think we've come to that point now, and I want to point this out. The phenomenological explains the historical, not the other way around. Big, huge word, phenomenological. Does anybody know what it means? Phenomenological means what you experience. So what I'm saying is, what you experience determines the history, not the other way around. In other words, the chronology of events does not determine what you experience. What you experience determines the chronology of events. I write the history according to what I experienced, not the other way. There's no independent CNN observer with a camera watching to see what happens next. I write down, what happened? I write down my recollection of my experience. I don't have an independent observer recording all the events, right? And by the way, we should know this for sure, because think about the experience of the people who came to the empty tomb, right? What mattered to them? Well, first, they were completely confused about the empty tomb, but second, the ones who encountered the risen Christ, my gosh, what mattered to them was the experience, right? Okay? So the women run off and they tell the disciples. What do the disciples say? Yeah, right. He just came back from the dead. Yeah, right. Okay? They're being good Sadducees. You can't have a resurrection. It isn't part of our paradigm. Right? They don't believe. Why don't they believe? Didn't he tell them? I'm going to go away and I'm going to come back. Where I'm going, you can't go, all that kind of stuff. And then they say, what are you talking about? Where are you going? We can't come back. We can go anywhere you go. Right? All that kind of stuff, right? Okay, so let's take one more example. How about the two guys on the road to Emmaus? Right? This is really interesting because what does he say? It says he's walking along and he meets these two guys from the road to Emmaus and they're discussing all these things that have happened in Jerusalem. And Yeshua says, well, what's all that about? He said, haven't you heard? Da, 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 da. And they go through all the stuff about what is happening, right? And then what does it say? And then it says, Yeshua explained to them from the scriptures how all this was foretold. Okay, what does that mean? They didn't have the scriptures before? Of course they had the scriptures. They knew the scriptures, that way he explained it to them. They had all of the words right in front of them. They just didn't understand what it meant. And these are two Orthodox guys, right? They've been having the word since they were little tiny babies in the synagogue school. But it doesn't mean that they understood the paradigm that Yeshua explained to them using the same text that they had. Right? Okay. Last example. You know that when Yeshua's on the cross, he says, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, right? In one version. Luke has a different version, okay? Same idea. Aramaic, okay? And the crowd that's surrounding him says what? They say he's crying out for Elijah. Why? Because Elijah's nickname is Eli Eli, right? In Aramaic, but not in Hebrew. So the point is, there's a good example of how we now know that Yeshua was speaking in Hebrew, not in Aramaic, because the crowd would not have been confused, right? Okay, so the point is, when he calls out Eli, Eli in Hebrew, he can only mean one thing. What is it? A reference to Psalm 22, right? Because it starts that way, okay? Does that mean that God was abandoning him at the cross? Because that's what Christian theology teaches. If I cite the first few words of Psalm 22, what does my audience think? My audience thinks, because, by the way, he isn't on the cross saying, Psalm 22, Psalm 22. No. They didn't know. There were no numbers. There were no verse numbers or any of that kind of stuff for hundreds of years later, okay? What they knew is that the psalm began, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, right? And when they heard that, they realized that he was pointing them to Psalm 22. And what is Psalm 22 about? Is it about, my God, why have you abandoned me? No, what's it about? It's about vindication. If you read the rest of the psalm, it's about the innocent being vindicated by God. So he's not saying, why has God abandoned me? He's saying, look at what's happening and remember that God is vindicating me. Okay? So again, the paradigm. The Christian church views it outside the context of the Hebraic culture, and they don't understand that what's happening is a vindication, not an abandonment. So we get the doctrine that God couldn't look on Jesus because he took on the sin of the world. It's not what the verse is about at all. Okay? So our paradigm dictates how we understand the text. And in this case, the experience that we have dictates how we write the history. Okay? The experience comes first, the history comes second. Okay? Okay. So the creation of meaning is precisely to not control it. Right? When I interpret my experience and write it down so that you can read it, I let go of the control that I have over the experience because now you will interpret it, right? And you might interpret it very differently than I do. And anyone who has children knows that that's the case. You tell them to do something and they say, yeah, but I did that. And you realize, of course, that they didn't understand what you said at all, even though you perfectly well understood it, right? Because it was, you let go of the control over it as soon as you communicated it to somebody else. And that's exactly what happens in the biblical text. The text communicates to you, and in the process, lets go of controlling it, because now you interpret it. And you'll interpret it according to your journey and your experience and your background. And that just means it's a creative document. It is the, where's the gentleman back there? It is the living word, which means that it's subject to interpretation, right? If it wasn't the living word, it would be fossilized. It would be fixed entirely. There would be no argument at all about exactly what it meant, right? Yes.
Okay. So, what do you see as the role of the Holy Spirit when you're reading Scripture?
Thank you very much. You're the second person who's asked that question.
Oh, all
I'll
right.
give you a silver star. She got the gold star.
Well, all right. It's just when I've read it, there's been times where I've experienced like verses kind of being highlighted for me or bold-faced or, that kind of thing.
And isn't it nice to know that God can actually do that stuff? Right? But now the question is, what is the role of the Ruach HaKodesh in the reading of Scripture? Okay? And again, you're just listening. If you don't like what I have to say, just put it on the shelf, return the book that you bought, and go home, right? Okay? The Ruach HaKodesh is, in Jewish thinking, God's interaction with men in the world. Okay, let me say that again. The Ruach HaKodesh is not a person in the Trinity. That's a Christian idea that was developed between the 3rd and the 4th centuries of the Common Era by an argument between Athanasius and Arius, and ultimately resolved by a couple of bishops. Okay? Okay? Even the early church fathers didn't have a person of the Holy Spirit. They had a divine Jesus and God the Father, but they didn't have a person of the Holy Spirit. Okay? So church doctrine introduced that idea. But Jewish idea is that God interacts with men, and God's interaction with men is the operation of the Spirit. Right? Remember Genesis 2? The Spirit of the Lord hovered over the face of the deep. Okay? It's God interaction with men. So what you've experienced is God interacting with you and bringing to light something that you needed to hear or something that you didn't see before or, that kind of stuff. Because, quite frankly, God interacts with us, doesn't he? And he might highlight something that you've read 100 times and then all of a sudden it means something different or it has some importance, okay? Isn't it nice to know that God hasn't abandoned you to a text? That he's actually let you interact in such a way that he's right there with you. Okay? So if you think of it like that, then the role of the Spirit is to enlighten, to encourage, to instruct. How does he do that? Through the text, and through your communication with him in prayer, and through the experiences that you have in life, and through the accidents that happen in your life, right? I used to tell people, if you really want to understand what your role in life is, then start paying attention to the interruptions. Look, there are three words for time in Greek, and I'm not going to forget about you, okay? 3 words for time. Chronos, that's this stuff, right? Chronos is the division of time into equal segments. It doesn't matter if they're nanoseconds or centuries. Chronos, chronological, okay? Then there's another word, aeon, which means an age. It has a beginning, it has an end. It doesn't necessarily have to have a fixed beginning and end, but there's the age of the whatever, okay? And then there's a word, Kairos. And Kairos doesn't have an English translation. But it's the word that Mark uses all the time for, and it came to be, or when the time was right, or something like that. Kairos is the intervention of the divine into our planned chronology. Chronology is the things that we plan, right? Your day planner, or in this case, your phone. Okay? You have all the appointments and everything in there, right? That's you manage that. Okay? But God comes along in Kairos time, which means that you can't plan it because it's not yours. It happens whenever he feels like it, and you have to be prepared for the interruption. Okay? So if you're not prepared for the interruption, if your day is so planned that you can't have any interruptions, you probably aren't going to experience God. Okay? If things happen that were not under your control, that you didn't plan for, that's probably the time when you need to ask yourself, oh, is God talking to me? Right? So you go to get gas, and there's a lady there with a flat tire. And you think, oh my gosh, I'm so busy. I got this meeting, this meeting, this meeting. You get in your car and you drive on. Somebody will take care of her. You just missed what God was planning for you. Because if you stop and let the interruption interrupt you from your plans, you might discover that God had something in mind. Yes. No. Yes. We can have a break, but she had a question. So you get...
So you said about vindicate. I don't know the word, so I just looked it up.
The what word?
Oh, can you turn this one down? It's really hot. Very, 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 very. Thank you. But it's
Okay,
still
you
hot.
said about
Vindicated?
vindicate.
The word
okay.
vindicated, so what
Vindicate.
Yeshua
It
said-
means to justify, to provide a reason for. To vindicate means to overcome the resistance to, right?
Yes, so I just looked it up, exactly what you said, so that they
Good.
are proved to be correct after people have said that they were wrong. So what exactly did he say on the cross?
What he said is, I'm reminding you of Psalm 22. You think that I'm being crucified because I have blasphemed God or I've committed an act of sedition against the Roman government. Okay? That's what you think. That's what a person is hung on the cross for. And what he says in Psalm 22 is, don't you realize that God is vindicating me? That God is doing something on the cross that you don't see, which is to justify this action as part of the divine plan. Okay? And he reminds them of that by telling them to go look at Psalm 22. Okay, so now we can cover a couple of things pretty quickly because we've had long discussions about this. And I just want to give you the comments of people who are working in the area of textual criticism. And this is Sydney White Crawford, somebody that you should know, right? And she says, in Second Temple Judaism, so what's Second Temple Judaism? That's the period of time that we're talking about when Yeshua and the rabbis were active, okay? In Second Temple Judaism, there is neither a finally closed canon of Scripture nor a finally fixed text of what became the Jewish canon. Did you get that? In Second Temple Judaism, that means up through and including the destruction of Jerusalem and the expulsion of the Jews, Second Temple Judaism, up to that time. There was no, do you understand what she said? No finally fixed text. That means the sentences, right? And the Jewish canon didn't exist yet, okay? During the Second Temple period, we begin to see the development or progress toward a canon of Scripture, beginning most obviously with the books of Moses, okay? The shape of the Torah, I would argue, was in place. That is, okay, here's kind of the parameters, right? But was in place by the 3rd century BCE. That's when the rabbis started really their working. But the Septuagint translation was made in about 2nd century BCE, but the text was still fluid. That means you might know that the books of Moses are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, but that doesn't mean that you know all the verses inside are exactly what we have now, because they were still being modified and changed and etc. Now, okay, let's look at another one. Okay? Further, the word Bible in English or Bible in German conveys the idea of a codex. What's a codex? My leg hurts. Give me this, please. This is a codex. It has a back cover and a front cover, and everything is in between. That's a codex, a book. Okay? Right? A fixed order of text and books found between two covers. All of these connotations are simply incorrect for Second Temple Judaism. Why? Because they didn't have a codex. First they had scrolls, which are not a codex, and some communities had some scrolls and some communities had other scrolls, and even if the temple had all the scrolls, they were never in a book. Okay? So it's important to keep in mind that the different communities had different collections of texts. Right? Did that prevent them from worshiping God? No. Did it prevent them from having fellowship with each other? No. In other words, the text wasn't the center of their religion. Okay, so what was? A Bible. Ta Biblia, the Greek. The books. Notice that in Greek, the noun is plural rather than singular. Right? The plural acknowledges the collection of authoritative books, which became an authoritative collection of books. Do you see what happened there? We shifted from a bunch of books that we considered authoritative to one collection of the books that we considered authoritative, okay? What the Bible was not in Jewish community was one book, which the English Bible or the German Bibel imply, rather than a collection of scrolls. Okay? Now, you might think, and it would be true today, that proper Orthodox Judaism doesn't mess with the scrolls. If you make a mistake, you got to throw the scroll out and start again. It has to be exactly like the one that you're copying from. But that wasn't true prior to the Babylonian captivity. They were making alterations and corrections as they went along. Okay, and we'll find out about that now. Okay, so although critical scholars, as opposed to the public at large, know that the MT, what's the MT? The Masoretic text, thank you very much. What's the Masoretic text? What is it? It's the Hebrew Bible from the 10th century of the Common Era. That means it's only 1,000 years ago, not 2,000 years ago. Okay? 10th century, the Common Era, standardized by a group called the Masoretes who were in Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee. And what did they do? They added the vowel points and the cantillation and the syllabication, and they corrected any of the text that they felt wasn't within the tradition, right? Which is why you have kuri kativ, things that are read but not written, etc. Okay, because they were making sure that everybody read the same thing. Okay, and that text becomes the basis for almost all English translations of the Bible. Now, what the English translations don't tell you is that there are places in the Masoretic text that don't make any sense. I mean, literally don't make any sense. Hebrew grammar that's incorrect. Words that don't have any meaning anymore for us, okay? So what do the translators do? They use a piece from the Septuagint. They use a piece from the Samaritan Pentateuch. They collect stuff from other sources to make the English Bible read correctly. But they just don't tell you that they did that, right? You think that they're translating one authoritative text, but they're not. If you have, does anybody know who Robert Alter is? Yes, you have the Hebrew Bible translated by Robert Alter. What a wonderful thing that you have. Because in the footnotes, he will tell you when this verse came from the Septuagint instead of the Masoretic text. When the Masoretic text grammar doesn't make any sense and they had to use this instead. So you have a Bible that actually tells you what the sources are, which doesn't happen in most of your English Bibles. Okay? What does that mean? That means that even if you went to the Masoretic text, you don't actually know that every word was God's word because it doesn't make any sense. You have to go and get pieces from other sources. Okay? So, what he says is most of the scholars know this, it's just that the public doesn't know it, right? But they don't even mention it. They still treat it as though the Masoretic text is the official text, okay? Since the discovery of the Qumran scrolls, it has become clear that a unified text tradition before the turn of the eras never existed. Never existed. Did you hear that? That we now know from Qumran that there were significant differences in parts of the Masoretic text that just were ignored or removed or added or all that. So there wasn't any unified text. And the really important thing about Qumran is that that version is 1,000 years earlier than the Masoretic text. So that means that the people who were living at the time of Yeshua didn't have an official Bible. They had whatever the scrolls of the community were, according to their community, and sometimes they were different than the scrolls of another community, right? And I'm going to give you some examples of that in a second, okay? The Masoretic text does not represent the Hebrew volage. That's the Sitzenleben. It doesn't help you either. That's the ethos, the feeling of the culture of the Septuagint, right? The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible in about the 2nd century BC. The Masoretic text doesn't represent that. Why? Because the Septuagint was translated from something else, which we don't have. In other words, if you look at, does anybody have a copy of the Septuagint? Yes. If you read the Septuagint, and then you read the Masoretic text alongside of it, guess what you discover? There's lots of differences. Right? And you think, how in the world could these guys translate this into Greek from a Hebrew text when it doesn't even say the same thing? Right? And it's because the translation of the Septuagint didn't come from a Masoretic or pro-Masoretic text. It came from someplace else, and we don't have that anymore. Right? Okay. Implications. Who can determine whether the text sequence of the Septuagint of Proverbs is preferable to that of the Masoretic text? They're different, right? Which chronology, that of the Masoretic text or the Samaritan Pentateuch or the Septuagint, should one prefer in Genesis? They're different, okay? And by the way, it isn't like one is older than the other. Remember, we're talking about a text from the 10th century, which obviously had references earlier than that, the 2nd century BCE, and the Samaritan Pentateuch, okay? So, which one should we take, right? Should we present as original the earlier Septuagint edition of Joshua and Judges, which combines the two books and removes Judges 1:1 to 3:11? How do you decide? Right? Okay, in sum, the text of the Bible is represented by a totality of its external witnesses, and not primarily by one of them. There's many, okay? In other words, if you were a believing community in the 1st century, you would have many different sources that you could choose as the, quote, Word of God, okay? Not one. Each Hebrew manuscript and ancient version represents a segment of the abstract entity that we call the text of the Bible. One finds the text of the Bible everywhere and nowhere. I say everywhere because all the manuscripts, from the ancient Qumran scrolls to the medieval Masoretic text manuscripts, attest to it. They all claim that there was an original. Okay? I say nowhere because we cannot call a single source extant or reconstructed the text of the Bible. For scholarly purposes, we should go back 2,200 years or more, beyond the incongruities created by the domination of the Masoretic text. Only in this way can we understand the Hebrew Bible. Okay? So, just to clarify, you have a Bible generally based on a Masoretic text from the medieval era, which assumes that there's a tradition that's much earlier. But there were also other versions of what we now call the Hebrew Bible that were floating around during the first century, and someone decided to take this one instead of that one. And they don't all agree. Is that okay? It's not so okay if you think the Bible is the one truthful word of God revealed to you. It's okay if you realize that the Bible is commentary on what the experience of God was for the people who were writing it. It doesn't mean that it's not truthful. It means that it's not the absolute fundamental of your faith. Right? You're not a Bible believer. You're a believer in the God of Israel. And the Bible is a commentary on what that means. Okay, it's a very useful commentary, a very important commentary, but as you can see in the first century, there were a lot of different choices, none of which made it impossible for the people to believe. They didn't go around worrying about which version they had. Okay? The word Bible evokes the image of a unified book, a codex, a unit, a collected anthology. But this was not the case in the Second Temple period. In this regard, the distinction between biblical and non-biblical manuscripts is likely to create more problems than it would solve. So, Enoch, Assumption of Moses, Testament of the 12, Jasher, the Gospel of Thomas, on and on and on. All of this material. By the way, there's a collection by Charles Worth of the pseudepigraphical and the apocryphal documents that were available in the 1st and 2nd century. Okay? 2 volumes. They're 1,000 pages each. So there's a lot of stuff.
Charles who?
I think it's Charles Worth. Okay? It's called the Pseudepigraphica of the Old Testament and the Apocrypha of the Old, or the something like that of the Old Testament. They're big, thick volumes like this, and they contain all kinds of documents that were in circulation during that time. I used one of them. It's called the Prayer of Manasseh. Okay? Yeah. The Prayer of Manasseh is a pseudepigraphical work. It's put into the mouth of Manasseh, but it's obviously not, because it was written sometime between the 1st century BC and the 1st century Common Era, right? But it has all the right cool stuff about how Jewish prayer goes, so it's really interesting. But it was in circulation in the 1st century, and people read it, right? It was part of their sacred material. So were all of these other documents, most of which you've never heard of. Okay? But that doesn't mean that the religious believing people of the 1st century never heard of them. Right? Just like 1st Enoch and how important that was. Okay? So, for Qumran sectarians, authority applied to the content of the book, and the differences in the details were disregarded. Right? They didn't really care about the details. What do they care about? Oh, you have Genesis, you have Exodus, you have Leviticus. Oh, so your copy of Genesis doesn't begin until chapter 6. So what? We still got it, right? It's like, Okay. The process of writing, this is important. The process of writing, interpretation, and rewriting has been an integral part of the development of biblical literature since the days of its creation. These processes characterize all literatures that were created in antiquity. In antiquity, it was perfectly okay to modify a text because now I thought of it differently. Right? And by the way, not put in a footnote that says, I'm changing this. They just changed it. Because after all, was the text important or was the experience important? The experience was important, so if I modify the text, so I just made it a little bit more understandable. I just filled in the gaps so that it read smoothly. Okay? All right? Sense. We picture the beginning of several genres of the biblical literature As oral compositions, the rewriting actually took place as rephrasing. Creative minds constantly rephrasing earlier formulations. Right? Remember the telephone game? Okay? You tell somebody something and they pass it down the line. By the time it gets to the end, it's not exactly what you said. Right? So if you have an oral tradition before you get to the written text where the copyists were very meticulous, it's all oral before that. If you get to the oral tradition, the story gets modified to fit the audience. That's all. And it's not like, oh my gosh, I can't believe anymore. Because the Bible isn't certain. But it never was until we decided it had to be. Right? I mean, the truth of the matter is, all those guys that we read about in the Tanakh, they didn't concern themselves with the certainty of the text. They were interested in their relationship to God. Okay? It didn't become necessary to be certain until we decided that certainty was more important than the relationship. There's a book by Peter Enns, you love it. It's called The Sin of Certainty. It's really great because it helps you understand just how much Greek philosophical thinking has invaded our thinking about the Hebrew Scriptures. And by the way, it's not just the Christians, the Jews as well. Right? The whole idea that every word and every letter of every word is exactly what God wanted is a Jewish idea that comes from this quest for certainty. Okay? All right. Yes.
So I'm just curious.
I don't think that mic is on.
I'm just curious.
Go.
Yeshua is supposed to be the living word. That's what we refer to him as.
Yep.
Which version is he?
What a great comment. Which version? Yeah. And that's a really good question because immediately you recognize how crazy it is to think that there's only one version, right? Which version is he, right? So, obviously he's the right one. Right? The living word doesn't mean the certain word that's fixed and can't ever be changed and can never be modified, and it's exactly what it is for all eternity. Right? Because that's not relationship, is it? I use this example in a phone call that I had today. Right? I said, listen, are you married because you have a certain document, there's a ring on somebody's finger, you've made a commitment to a mortgage, you have shared credit cards, does that make you married? No, the paperwork doesn't make you married. The commitment to the relationship makes you married. If you take all that paperwork away, you're still married if you have a commitment to the relationship. So it's the same thing with the Bible, isn't it? If I took all the Bible away, would you still believe in the God of Israel? Yeah, why? Because something happened in your life that convinced you that the God of Israel cares about you, and you care about him. And the biblical text, just like Abraham, is supplemental to that, right? Now, isn't it wonderful that you have the biblical text? We're so blessed. We don't have to be like Abraham and wait for 13 years for God to show up again. Remember? So he has this little fling with Hagar, and then for 13 years, God doesn't show up, right? That's not so cool. I mean, we can just pull the book off. If we're feeling a little depressed, we just pull the book off the shelf and turn to the Psalms. Isn't it nice that God provided for us, weak people as we are, a way for us to have a constant reminder of his care instead of having to wait 13 years before his visitations? I don't think most of us could handle that kind of a faith. Okay? So the point is, he's blessed us, because he knows that we're fragile and weak people and we need something to remind us that he still cares. Okay? We're not like Abraham, who somehow persevered for 13 years. Okay? But the point is, now that we have that blessing, we should treasure it. But it doesn't mean that it's the reason that we have the blessing. The blessing comes from the relationship with God, not from the book. Yes?
So was it then never intended maybe to be written down?
Well, I'm sorry, what?
Maybe it was never intended to be written down, because it was never written down before Moses, and even Yeshua didn't write anything down, and that's why it was living. Because if you tell it, it's a living story, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. As long as it remains oral, it's living, because the only way it gets transmitted is through actual living people. One storyteller to another storyteller, okay? As soon as I write it down, I freeze it, okay? And of course, that's what happens with Hellenism, right? Because we've moved into a cognitive understanding of the world rather than an experiential one. In a cognitive understanding of the world, we need to have things in black and white. So we start writing things down. Of course, they wrote things down before that, but I'm not sure that writing them down was more important than the storytelling, right? Okay? Yes?
So what does it mean in Hebrew when they say, don't add one dot or tittle or take away, please?
Yes. Okay. So, who's the audience? Where does it come from? Deuteronomy. Who's the audience? The ex-slaves coming out of Egypt. Okay? Why would Moses want to instruct them that they weren't supposed to add or take away from anything that God was telling them? Because of their previous experience in Egypt, right? Okay, so let me give you a little example. Maybe we can figure this out. Which commandment of the 10 commandments requires the most explanation? Okay, wait a minute. The first one is love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul, and that kind of thing, right? It actually is more like the Shema, right? But it doesn't require a lot of explanation, does it? It just tells you the commandment. What about you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not steal? Does it require explanation? He says, you shall not murder. Now let me explain what that is. First degree, second degree, manslaughter, No. Does he worry about that? No. Okay? Which one requires the most explanation? The Sabbath. Why? Because they've been slaves for several hundred years, and nobody knew what the Sabbath was anymore, because the Egyptians, of course, said, oh yeah, the Sabbath, you don't have to work on that day. No. They were slaves. They worked every day. Nobody gave them time off for a religious celebration. So God has to go through and say, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. And by the way, what does that mean? Oh, your manservants, your maidservants, your cattle, your sheep. Da-da-da. He goes through all that explanation, verse after verse after verse of what the Sabbath means. Okay? Why? Because they didn't know. Did they know what murder was? Yeah, so he just says, don't murder. Right? Don't lie. Easy. I know that. But the things that I don't know, he has to explain. Okay? So, now let's go back to your question. Why would Moses instruct the people not to add or take away in that environment? Because he wants the revelation of the law, the Torah, to be sacrosanct. You can't mess with it. Right? This is exactly what God wants you to understand. This is what he wants you to know. And nobody is going to take something away from it and say, oh, well, that doesn't matter because God didn't really mean that, or add to it. Okay? For those people, why do they need to know that? Why do they need to know that? Okay, well, let's back up. You need to know something about the ancient world. In the ancient world, what was the relationship between the gods and men? In a word. Fear. One word. Why? Why were men afraid of the gods in the ancient world? Because they didn't know what they wanted. It's real simple. There were gods, of course, lots of them. But you never heard them say what they wanted. So you just always lived in fear that you would do something wrong. Okay? So today you come out of the door of your house and God slams you into the ground. And you say, why did you do that? You go to the priest, he says, well, because this is Thursday. What? Yeah, you can't come out of the door of your house until after 8 o'clock on Thursdays. So next Thursday, you're real careful and you go out of the door after 8 o'clock. And God hits you with a lightning bolt. And you say, why did he hit me with a lightning bolt? I went out of the door after 8 o'clock. Yeah, but it's the third Thursday of the month. And on the third Thursday of the... I mean, you see how crazy it is? I'm telling you, there are Babylonian poets who basically write like this. Better that men never be born at all. If they are, to die as quickly as possible, because we don't know what in the hell is going to happen to us, and it's better to be dead than to have to live like this. Okay? That's really the action between men and gods in the ancient world. Scared to death that you're going to do something that God won't like. So everybody has to live below the radar. Do as little as possible to not upset the gods. Okay? Then along comes the God of Israel. What does he do? He tells you exactly what makes him happy and what doesn't. And you are not to change it. You're not to take away anything or add anything to it, because these instructions remove the fear of God, and you no longer have to live in anxiety. Okay? What are the implications? Here's the implication. The law is freedom. It's freedom because you finally know what God wants. Okay? For Martin Luther, the law was restriction, because his view of law is something that prevents you from doing something. The Hebrew view of law is something that removes the anxiety of doing things. Okay? Huge, huge change, which is why, since the Protestant Reformation, law and grace are opposed to each other. But they're not opposed to each other in Hebrew, are they? Because law is freedom, and grace is God's ability to interact with you in a free way. It's real simple, hand and glove. But not in Luther, because law is restriction and grace is freedom. Exactly the opposite of the Hebrew worldview. So, not adding or taking away means don't mess with the anti-anxiety drug. Okay? Don't make a mistake by thinking that if I just change this little thing right here, I can, just go on my merry way, because now you've introduced anxiety. Yes? No, my gosh, no. The rabbis are imaginative. They do all kinds of things to expand the law. But they all claim, of course, that it's just an implication of what was in the law anyway. Do you know about the Shabbat elevator? Yeah, you all know about the Shabbat elevator? I don't have to tell you about it, right? No?
No.
No. Okay, so if you're in Jerusalem on Shabbat, in Jerusalem, not in Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv is a completely pagan city. Okay? But Jerusalem isn't. So on Shabbat in Jerusalem, the elevators don't run the way that they normally do the rest of the week, because there's a prohibition against kindling a fire on Shabbat. And the rabbis believe that pushing the button on the elevator, which causes a spark of electricity that tells the elevator which floor to go to, is kindling a fire. Okay? So the elevator just stops on every floor on the way up and every floor on the way down automatically, so you don't have to push the button. Okay? So if you're on the 27th floor of the Jerusalem Sheraton, you have a long ride. You will stop on 26 floors on the way up and 26 floors on the way down. But you won't have to push the button, so you won't violate the Shabbat. Right? Okay, so that's a rabbinic interpretation of a law not to kindle a fire, expanded. I mean, think about it. The 10 Commandments are, in Hebrew, actually, they're called the 10 words. So you can see how small they are. But there is tractate after tractate after tractate in the Talmud explaining all of the details of what these things imply. So is that adding to? Not in a Jewish sense, because it's just an implication of what was already there to begin with. Okay? Right? How far can you extend your hand on Shabbat? You never thought that was a problem? It says you're not supposed to work, so how far can you extend your hand before it's work? No, you're laughing. This is serious. There are 139 laws about what you can carry, how far you can extend your hand, who you can greet, where you can walk, all implied in you shall do no work. Okay? Yes. Yeah, the traditions of men. But the traditions of men are only traditions if they're not already based in the... Look, this is what you call deductive theology. In other words, what they claim is it's already implied. I'm just spelling it out for you. So it's not adding anything. It's just spelling out what was already there. You look at it and say, well, is it 6 inches or 7 inches? Yes.
Okay, so listening to her question and then having talked to Pat earlier, and going back to Yeshua, his beef with the scribes and the Pharisees of his day is that they're not concentrating on the weightier matters. And, you know, the House of Hillel knows better. And so he's chastising them like, you're putting burdens on men.
Sure.
And
the
so...
seat of Moses argument.
Say that again?
It's the seat of Moses argument, where he says, when they sit in the seat of Moses, listen to what they say, but don't do it as they do it.
Yeah,
Right.
okay.
Okay, so, but let's make sure that we understand that he's not talking about all the Pharisees. He's talking about a group of the Pharisees who were being hypocritical. And the Pharisees themselves were chastising their own people for exactly those reasons.
Oh, okay. So a good book to read for that would be what? Jesus the Pharisee?
Meet the Rabbis, Brad Young.
Meet the Rabbis? Okay. Yeah, because, I mean, these are great questions. I mean, we're looking at Yeshua in the context and we're trying to stay focused on him, like how do we live our lives?
Yeah, but he was a
to the
Pharisee.
Lord. Yeah, I know, Yeshua the Pharisee.
Not exactly,
Jesus the Pharisee.
but closer to the Pharisees than anybody else. So
Right.
he didn't have any, you know, the arguments are intramural arguments, right? They're not Yeshua against the Pharisees. They're the Pharisee like Yeshua against those Pharisees who are not being good Pharisees. Do you understand? Okay? So Meet the Rabbis is what you want to read, because Brad Young will show you that a whole bunch of the stuff that Yeshua was talking about was exactly what the Pharisees were already doing. It's just that some of them were being hypocrites. And you know what? Some of us are being hypocrites. And then somebody will stand up and say, you hypocrite, why are you doing this kind of stuff? Or aren't you supposed to be following this? I mean, it's the same thing, right? Okay, can we go forward? Yeah, yes, okay. Yes, sir.
Just
Man.
one small comment that reading, like spelling out what's implied in the Ten Commandments sounds a lot like the court system interpreting the Constitution.
And guess what?
Things are in the penumbra of the Constitution that aren't in the text, but, oh, you don't see it, I see it, and I have more education than you, so it's there.
Yes, but interestingly enough, the Hebraic system of justice does not depend on a court system, right? Why? Because it doesn't believe that there are universally applicable laws that cover everybody, right? Why? Because it believes in a divine sovereign whose will is the law. That's very different than us, right? We have a law that's supposed to apply to everyone, except if you're Bill Clinton and Barack Obama and et cetera, right? Okay? So the law is supposed to apply to everyone. Fauci's another one of those guys, right? Doesn't apply to him because, what? I don't know, he's not subject to the law. But in our system of justice, the law is the top of the chain. Not so in Hebrew. In Hebrew, God is the top of the chain. And if God changes his mind about things, so what? He's the sovereign. He can do that. The king can decide. So all Hebrew justice is based on what we would call case law. So the king looks to see what kinds of decisions were made before, and he tries to make the same kinds of decisions. But he doesn't appeal to a constitution, right? You have to change your thinking about justice. That's all. Okay. A number of fragmentary biblical scrolls dating to the 2nd century AD, right? That's after the death of all the apostles, discovered in the South Wadi Qumran, suggest that about the same time the canon was developing, so too was the notion of a fixed authoritative text. So what does that tell you? Prior to the 2nd century AD, there wasn't any fixed authoritative text, okay? And it was starting to develop because all the 2nd century AD biblical manuscripts from the caves of South Qumran are proto-Masoretic texts. That means by this period, A tradition was started that eventually became the Masoretic text in the 10th century. Okay? Okay, so now let's talk about the important stuff. Now you have the academic background. If you're really interested in all this, I have dozens of articles that Pat can get from me on PDF that you can read, all the scholarly work. Some of it is very technical stuff, showing you how the Hebrew text was manipulated and changed and et cetera, okay? All that kind of stuff, if you're interested. But this is the important stuff, that there's a difference between inspired, sacred, and canon. And if we mix them up, we're going to have real problems. What does inspired mean? It basically means brought to tears. You know, it's the things that happen in your life that make you weep. It can be the weeping for joy over an absolutely beautiful sunrise, which I've seen a few here in Alaska. Or it can be weeping in sorrow over something that happened that just moved you, that you just can't get the feeling out. Okay? It can be Beethoven's Ninth Symphony or Eric Clapton's Drifting. Okay? Right? Depends on your background. Okay? Can be the experience of seeing, bears in the wilderness, or the floating in the Dead Sea at night in total sensory deprivation. That's inspired. It can also be, by the way, poetry and text and story and everything else. So we think of inspired as something that moves us, something that brings us to tears. And it's personal. It's what brings you to tears, something that moves you. It doesn't mean that, I don't know if Pat knows Eric Clapton's Drifting or not, but it's awesome. Okay? And maybe it just doesn't get with him. He likes AC/DC, so, Okay. So we're in different versions of inspired there. Okay, but the point is, what moves you also moves other people. And now as a community, we decide what things are going to be sacred to us. And sacred requires a community. It's not just me, it's us. And in that community, we accept certain things as inspired and sacred. Not everything that's inspired is sacred, but everything that's sacred is inspired. Got it? Okay? So now, in the community, we decide we're going to follow the first book of Enoch. We're going to follow the Gospel of Matthew. We don't like Luke too much, so we'll take Matthew instead, right? We're going to look at the 5 books of Moses. Terrific. But Song of Songs, a little bit too much sex there. We'll have to ignore that one, okay? So we have a bunch of books, of documents that we consider sacred. And how are they sacred? They govern our practice in the community. They govern the way that we do faith, okay? Eventually, the communities get bigger and more documents are added and more documents are removed until we get to the point where we need a government to manage all of this. We need some, officials that are in charge. And they get together, in the Christian church they're called bishops, and they get together and decide which books are going to be inspired, sacred, and canonized. Canonized means that they become the rule. Okay? A canon is nothing more than a rule. Okay? So the bishops got together in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries and decided which books they're going to take as canon. And we have that today in the English Bible, except, of course, that the Protestants had to remove some books because they didn't want to be Catholic. Okay? Got it? So every community goes through inspired, what moves me to tears, sacred, which we accept as a community for faith and practice, and eventually canon. They're not the same. What the scholars are telling you is that there was no canon in the Second Temple period. There was no authoritative list of books. In fact, there was arguments over which books even belonged. Okay? There were sacred materials depending on which community you were in. And there were clearly inspired materials because people were still following God. Okay? If we understand those 3 different words, we will not get confused about what we have in the English Bible that we carry around today. Because what you have is inspired, sacred, and canonized. And it's the canonized part that makes us think that it's the official Word of God. Okay? All right. Text and tradition determine what is the shape of Scripture. Text and tradition. Because not just the text alone. There's lots of versions of the text. It's the tradition that I come from that helps me understand what I'm going to accept as the Bible, as the sacred, canonized, inspired text, right? And all of you here come from different traditions. Lo and behold, you all had a different journey to get here. So your version of inspired, sacred, and canonized will be a little bit different than mine. Obviously it is, or we wouldn't have any questions. I'd just be telling you the same things that you already know. Okay? Right? So the community determines what is sacred on the basis of its understanding of tradition. And you can see that in Judaism really, really well. Because the Talmud is tradition. It's the writing down of the oral tradition that accompanied the text for generation and generation and generation. It just happens to be written down now. Okay? And that helped decide what books they were going to accept as canonized. Okay? Canon is a late development based on a philosophical idea. Canon is based on the idea that there has to be one rule and it has to be certain. Okay? And we know that that wasn't the case even when Yeshua was practicing. Okay? So, non-canonical and non-biblical text are not terms that were used before the Babylonian captivity. In other words, before the Babylonian captivity, there was lots of stuff floating around that today we don't even know about or that we've rejected. Okay? The idea of a singular Bible development was a theological construct, not a practical one. All right, so can you just throw out the Bible? I mean, it's confusing, isn't it? You got all this stuff going on. People have no idea where the real sources were. Some stuff is lost. It looks confusing because there's all these different versions. So why don't we just get rid of the Bible and ask God to intervene with the Ruach HaKodesh, right? What's the purpose of Scripture in the first place? Heschel. Abraham Heschel has a really good answer. He says, to believe is to remember. Right? And why are you part of the family of Abraham? If you throw out the Bible, you can be in anybody's family. The whole point of the Bible is to help you remember what God has done with these people that you feel affiliation to. Right? It's to remember how God interacted with these people. To believe is to remember. And it's not just to call to mind. It's to practice. Because, as Heschel goes on to say, the festivals, the rituals, the practice is the remembering. You make yourself a part of the continuing chain from Abraham. In other words, Abraham's story is your story. He's your father. And he can only be your father if you have a way to trace back through the stories to Abraham. So what's the purpose of Scripture? To remind you of who you are. Right? To remind you of who you are. That's all. And, you know, when I was teaching in the seminary, all my students were pastors. And they went crazy over this stuff. Because for them, Scripture is doctrine. Scripture is dogma. Scripture is theology, right? But it's not. That's all Greek construction around these records of experience because the Scripture is there to remind you of who you are. And the only way that you can do that is to remind you of how much God is interacting with you. Okay? So, why does it matter? Well, how you read is more important than what you read. How you read the text, right? How you read. It's the emotional connection to the text that makes it matter, right? It's not just the words and the theology and the principles and stuff. It's the emotional connection to the text. The mind of the author is the eternal quest. We're constantly asking, what did John have in mind when he used those crazy words like logos? right? Why did Matthew present his gospel in 10 increments just like Genesis, right? We want to know what's happening in the author's head. The social political environment affects the outcome. So, Kings and Chronicles don't agree because they're political propaganda. And one of them is trying to make you feel good about the Davidic kingdom, and the other one is saying, boy, David and Solomon, those guys were a real mess, right? So Chronicles cleans it up, right? Okay? Understanding is difficult. You can't read just the surface of the text anymore. You can't just sit down and say, oh my gosh. Well, you can. Of course you can. You can read one of the Psalms and say, oh my gosh, that really moved me. That's not exegesis. It's not what the author intended. He didn't write it for you. He wrote it because there was some particular issue that was going on, and God was interacting with him. And if you really want to understand it, you got to read deep. Okay? Okay, so now here's the next question. How do I do that? I can't read Hebrew and Greek. Okay, so here's what you do. You start discovering things like the Blue Letter Bible, which is an online site that gives you the text of the Hebrew Bible and the Greek New Testament with all of the Strong's numbers for all of the important words. You know what a Strong's number is? Okay, so a guy named Strong, who was a railroad man, by hand went through the entire Bible and numbered all of the words that were all cognates, etc., right? And you can get a dictionary called the Strong's Dictionary, and it will give you a number from one of those words in the Greek or Hebrew text, and you can look up a shorthand dictionary definition of what that means. And Blue Letter Bible is an online version of that, so you don't even have to buy it. Isn't that wonderful? You can just go to Blue Letter Bible, pick any verse you want, and then you just click on the little button, and it shows you the Strong's numbers and a little bit of description. Okay? That gets you started. Okay, now let me tell you what you have to do after that, because that's surface. Now let's go deep. After that, after you have the Strong's number, you get the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament. Used to be in 2 volumes, now it's in 1. It is a longer description of the Hebrew words based on the Hebrew alphabet, of course, but in the back there's an index where you can look for the Strong's number that you already know and find out what the article is in the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament that gives you more information. Okay, isn't that wonderful? So now you have to buy that one, but now you've got a little definition from Strong's and a much longer definition from the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament, still based on the Strong's number so you can actually find it. Okay? Not so bad. Now by the way, there's a similar thing in Greek. In Greek, you can get what's called the Little Kittel. Okay? Kittel, the Little Kittel. It is the theological dictionary of the New Testament, which is about 10,000 pages, reduced to a little more than 1,000 pages. And, this is the important thing, it has an English index. So you don't have to read Greek in order to figure out where the word is. You can go look up English, compassion, and it will tell you what the Greek is so that you can go look in the dictionary. Okay? Now, of course, what you really want to do is have the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament in its entirety, 10,000 pages. Okay? And, of course, it occupies about this much space on my shelf, and it's fabulous, but the Greek is all in Greek. So you're going to have a hard time reading it if you don't read Greek. You want the English Little Kittel because it translates all the Greek passages into English, so you can read about the words in English, okay? And now let's go to the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible, from the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament, you can find the Hebrew word, and you can go look it up in the Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament, the TWOT, the TDOT, right? Which is, ready? 17 volumes, about 15,000 pages, right? On the Hebrew words. Let me tell you how this works. If you look up the word chesed in Strong's, you will find one paragraph. If you read about chesed in the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament, you'll find one page. If you read about chesed in the Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament, you'll find 15 pages. Okay? And then, of course, in the bibliographies are important, you'll see a book by Gluck called Chesed in the Old Testament, and it's 250 pages. So one word, 250 pages of what it's all about. Now you're deep into the text. Okay? And you can do it all. It's all in English. It's all translated. Some of it's online. Not a problem. Yes? Okay, that's a good grammar and has some stuff. But if you're interested in the grammar of the Old Testament, then that's a kind of old book now. And there are lots and lots of other grammars that are much easier to deal with. But just in terms of the vocabulary, right? Just stick with the dictionaries and the lexicons. That will give you plenty. Listen, if you can make your way through 15,000 pages in the New Testament and 17,000 pages in the Old, you're way ahead of the game, right? What's really amazing is this. You're not further along than a native speaker. Did you get that? If you're a native speaker, like my rabbi friend in Parma, I mean, he doesn't have to go to the Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament to know what chesed is about, because he's lived with it his whole life, right? That's our problem. We're trying to catch up on being absent from a culture in a document that we really want to know, and we have to fill in all the gaps, right? So I've just told you how to do that. And of course, if you want a little shorter way, you can just buy my books. Because I talk about that stuff too, especially in Spiritual Restoration 1, 2, and 3. It's all about what do these words mean, what was the context, what was the culture, etc. Okay? Now, let's see if we have more. Oh yeah. What is this book that we treasure so much? I hope you've got an answer to that now, right? It's not a theological text. It's not fodder for doctrine and dogma. It's commentary on the men and women who had an experience with God so that I can remember that I'm part of that too. And if I read it like that, it will come alive for me. Yes, dear.
So I used to subscribe to Christian book distributors, and they had some books by Josephus.
Yeah, History of the Jews, the Wars of the
Right.
Jews, etc.
And so is that something that would kind of fill in the gaps on the
It won't
history?
fill any of the gaps in for the stuff that we're talking about, which is the vocabulary and the culture and stuff. But it will fill in what first century Jews thought, because that's when Josephus wrote it, right? So you get a good cultural history, not lexicon, vocabulary, grammar, that kind of stuff. Okay? Cognitive dilemma versus volitional answers. So here's what I mean. We're stuck with the Western world. It's because we grew up in it. We're part of it. You can't just sort of disinherit yourself from the culture that caused you to be. Okay? But the Western world is cognitive. So its emphasis is on rational answers for one reason and one reason only: to predict and control. Right? That's what it's about. Why do I need to know how things work? So I can predict and control. The Western world is mental. Thank you, Plato and Aristotle. Okay? And we could spend several days talking about how that happened in the West. The difference is that the Hebrew worldview is volitional. What I mean, the Hebrew worldview is about experiential choice. Right? It's not about having all the answers before I can believe. It's about experiencing and choosing and then hoping that I get the answers. Because I might not. Right? But having the answers isn't the fundamental reason for me following God. It's because I have an experience and I choose to follow. So God will say things like this, I think. Choose me even if you think it's impossible, because your thinking that it's impossible is the cognitive side. So choose me. And by the way, the word for heart in Hebrew, lev, right, means rational, emotional, cognitive, volitional. It means all those things, right? In Greek, nous, mind, psyche, spirit, soma, body, but not in Hebrew. In Hebrew, lev, emotional, rational, cognitive, volitional, all together, right? Okay? And what's really interesting is, in some verses, the word lev becomes lebab. It's still the v sound, but it's a b, right? Lebab, which means that it's heightened heart. It's more heart, right? And you'll see that there's a really, really important verse about that early on in Genesis. I won't tell you anything more. You're going to have to go find it. Okay? Really important verse about heart in Genesis. Has something to do with God saying, not so good that Adam's by himself. Okay? You'll figure that out. Okay? So, get it? If you want the answer to all this stuff, all the critical scholarship that we've looked in the Bible, all the issues that we brought up, all the questions and confusion about versions and all that kind of stuff, the answer is not more mental exercise in order to try to get a certain answer, right? The answer is not looking for certainty. What is the answer? Choosing. Make a choice, right? That's all. Make a choice, right? And finally, making a choice to be human. And for that, I need a different presentation. Being human. So we get a little break while somebody loads being human up there. Are there any questions? You have more questions? Everybody is now completely... I used to say, don't call me a heretic until I actually am one. So now you can... Yes.
Well, can you turn this down just a little bit more, please? It's still very, very hot.
I mean, we want to know the original text, but does it really matter?
Wait, you want to know the original text?
No,
Good luck.
No, I mean, we try to understand, but I don't think it really matters because, it travels, it gets told again, and it is applied to what we do today. And, if it is about faith in a storytelling, and we can learn from them, then it doesn't really matter if the chair was on the left or the right or up or down.
Yeah,
it's the story, right?
Yeah, you're right. That from a Hebrew perspective, you're absolutely right. Doesn't matter if the chair was up or left or right, or the ark flew across the Jordan or not. Okay, so Jews treat the text differently than we do, right? Because their experience with God isn't based on the text. It's based on their experience and their tradition and their heritage with God. So the text only assists. It isn't the fundamentals. So they have a very nice, fluid, easy relationship with the text. However, they don't intend to find the original text because they already have a paradigm that says that they have it.
Right. But also for us, right? It's the same thing.
Yeah, so now what you're discovering is your Western paradigm, especially the paradigm coming out of the Christian church, teaches you that you have the authoritative Word of God. And now what you've discovered is all the scholars are saying, no, it doesn't quite work like that. But does that shake your face so that you can't believe anymore? Hopefully not. What it says is, oh my gosh, the Bible's so cool. It's just filled with all this neat stuff that I can learn about how God related with other people, and some of it applies to me, and it's terrific, right? And so I no longer have the fear of not getting the right answer. Now I have the freedom to explore what's happening in those relationships so that I can experience the same thing that they experienced, right? But the idea that I will ever find an original perfect text, forget it. No scholar is ever going to tell you that that's possible because, as you can see, there's all of these issues going on prior to the first century, after the Babylonian captivity. We're kind of stuck, right? Yes?
Is this on? Okay. When you talk about cognitive dilemma,
I talk about what?
Cognitive dilemma, where we just kind of always are thinking, or we come from a rational thought. well, the church will say when there's lots of questions, it's like we are taught like replacement theology, or well, that's not for this dispensation, or we're taught that the God of the Old Testament is punitive, but Jesus came to save us from him. So there's a lot to wade through because those things are very confusing, or just the basic that Jesus rose on the third day, but if Sabbath was Friday, but we don't know of the high Sabbath, what I'm saying is there are lots of questions, and it gets reduced down to replacement theology, or it's not for this dispensation. So there's a lot to wade through.
Yeah, but you understand that stuff, and you know that you're going to have to work your way through it if it becomes important enough for you to actually deal with the people who think along those lines, okay? But my point is that once you start down the path of the Bible isn't theology, then those issues don't quite become as important as they used to be when you needed to have the right answers. Because now what you realize is the right answers are based on a paradigm, and the paradigm dictates what the answer will be before you get there. And then the church tells you, if you don't believe the way we believe, then you're excommunicated and you're out and you're going to hell. So they have what do I call it? Terrorism evangelism, right? Okay? I mean, look, you need to live in Italy like me. Every church you go to has a painting of the judgment and all these people being eaten and hacked to pieces and boiled and everything. And you see that every time you walk in, right? So what do you think little kids think? My God, if I don't do exactly what the priest says, I'm going to go there. It's terrorism evangelism. It's scaring people into heaven, right? Yeah. Yes, dear. One more.
So some of these issues that the church expounds on, like say the relationship between a man and a woman and marriage and stuff like that, this is all relative. It's not absolute.
Their explanations are relative. I'm not quite sure what your question was.
Well, I mean, you've been presenting that the Bible is stories that have been put together and they've changed over time. And so I'm just thinking of some of Paul's letters in the New Testament where he talks about what a woman's role should be, what a man's role should be. I'm just wondering about it being relative versus absolute.
So Paul's letter is written to a particular audience. I think you're referring to the Ephesians, right? Where he says, husbands, love your wives, wives, be in submission to your husband, that kind of stuff, okay? Ephesians 5. There's some really interesting stuff going on there. If you read my book, Guardian Angel, you'd see why the church interpreted it one way, but in fact, even the Greek text does. You know that verse says, wives, submit to your husbands? No, is that what it says? Mm-hmm. Something like that. I can't remember exactly. Okay? Do you realize that in that verse there's no verb in the Greek? It just says wives to your husbands. Right? So fill in whatever you want. What would you like, Patty? Fill in whatever you like. Okay? So wives to your husbands. In Greek it's called an ellipsis. And what it means is that Paul didn't write his own letters. He dictated them and somebody wrote them down. And of course you had to pay people to do the dictation. And so you use as few words as possible because you're being paid by the word, right? So the previous verse says in submission, right? One to another in mutual submission as Christ was in submission, right? That's the idea. So the verb is submission. Hupotasso is the Greek, okay? And Paul leaves it out because he has to pay for an extra word, right? So it just says wives to your husband, and he implies hupotasso. But if I go look at hupotasso from the implication, what does it say? Mutual hupotasso. It doesn't say one lording it over the other. It says mutual hupotasso, which is what Paul implies, okay? So now you have to rethink that whole thing from the Christian perspective because men are not in charge. They are mutually submitted. What does that mean? It means that they sacrifice themselves for their wives just as the wives sacrifice themselves for their husbands, right? It means that see, she's agreeing. Okay? I mean, this stuff all comes about because of Christian doctrinal history. And there's a reason why it got translated the way that it did, because of the church's perspective. But if you go back to the text, and particularly if you ask Paul, who's a rabbi, who certainly knows what's going on in the Genesis passage, he's not going to tell you something in a letter to an assembly that doesn't match up with Genesis. So you have to know what happens in Genesis chapter 2 and 3 in order to understand what Paul's writing about in Ephesians. That's all. Okay? Yeah, that's all. So my book, Guardian Angel, is all about that. How are we going to understand Paul if we don't know what's going on in Genesis? Because that's what he refers to, right? Remember, he says, just as a woman came out of man, well, what's he talking about? Genesis chapter 2. So how can you possibly understand what he's thinking if you don't know what's going on in Genesis chapter 2? Right?
Okay. Very quick, okay?
Not exactly a question you got to expound on. You said the answer is not about blank, it's about choice. The answer is about choice. What was the blank?
Oh, I thought you said that I
Certainty.
said the answer is not about blank.
No. That's funny.
She missed the word.
Yeah,
You missed a word. Oh my gosh. I'm so sorry. Yeah. The answer is not about cognition. It's not about thinking. It's about doing, right? The answer is not about cognition. It's about volition. Means what you choose, right? So look, that should be really obvious. What does Moses say? Choose life or death. This day, choose life, right? That's the Hebrew. The Hebrew perspective is what you choose. The Greek perspective is what you think. There's a difference.